Welcome to Principles of International Relations. In today's class, we will talk about globalization. And this is basically a continuation of our previous class where we talked about trade policy and the opening of global trade. But unlike in the previous class where we talked about trade policies more specifically, this time we want to look at the effects, the roles, the barriers, etc. of globalization in itself as an economic, but also as a political and a social movement. So in this class, we will really kind of have a deep look at the consequences, positive as well as negative, of an increasing population. So I hope you will enjoy this class. Please stay tuned. I will go right into the slides. Thank you.
Okay, here we are again. And we will talk about globalization in this class. And if I want to make an outline about how I think we should discuss globalization or what the key questions are, I would like to list a couple of them now and then kind of go through them in more detail. So the first one is really, what do we mean by globalization? So I think this is a household term, so it's most of you will be familiar with it. But what it exactly means is sometimes a bit difficult, and so in order to understand it, we need to make some kind of definition. And then, depending on these kind of definitions, how you see it and what you see as a baseline, the question is, how far are we along with globalization? Is this actually a situation where the world is more or less globalized, or are we in a relatively early stage of globalization? And the real kind of question of this is what we see as a baseline rather than where we are standing at the moment. So then I want to kind of go to do this, kind of understand the contextual situation of globalization. I would like to go through some historic content as well and see how historically globalization developed and how we can see it today. And then I will kind of try to make three different kind of arguments. The first one is the implication for economic growth. What is the impact of globalization? And is it always positive? Is it sometimes positive? Is it normally negative? How can we see it? This is kind of discussed controversially, and I think we can kind of shed some light on this. And then I want to kind of also look at implications for equality and the environment. Some of the kind of most controversially discussed topics around the idea of globalization. And in the last part, I want to talk about what form does globalization, what kind of markets does it create? Does it create interdependent of economic markets or an integration of markets? And what that means is a bit difficult. But so what we will find at a later stage is that globalization means also that there is a reduction of the sovereignty of the individual states taking place. Why? Because they need to find regulations and policies with coordination with other countries. And the more these kind of integration is taken, or this globalization is taking place, the more integrated this market become, the less influence the individual country has on its policy decisions. And there are kind of two different aspects how we can interpret this. One is kind of seen as interdependence, so that markets are depending on other markets, but they're essentially individual and independent of other markets in other countries, or a form of integration of markets. And that means more like that actually the markets merge and that they become assimilated. And something like integration we see especially in the single market in the European Union, where the market essentially becomes one rather than several interdependent markets. So if we kind of think about globalization and a definition, variations of definition, we can see that it's often defined expansively as network of interdependent that span intercontinental distances. So this is really about the distance, right? So we have networks and they're kind of interacting, they're interdependent. And the important aspect is that it's actually intercontinental and going across the globe, not just within a region, not just within a country, but rather on a global level. It's also kind of seen that globalization has a profound effect on economic and political life. That we, from an economic dimension, we often say that economic integration is an economic integration at a global level. That means like these kind of interdependence economically kind of creates maybe one single market or a very interdependent economic market, and again the emphasis on the global level. Or if you think about the political dimension, we often think about the ideas of global governments and decision making taken away from the national government towards some kind of international body. Why is this the case? Well, because in order to have similar or kind of unified policies, there needs to be a coordination process within the among the nation states, and so this is kind of often seen in terms of the solution for this is often seen in global governance. We could see this in forms of international organizations like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, but also in less formalized structures like the G20 or this G7, which are much more network-based rather than kind of institution-based. If you think about it of the part of economic globalization, we can see two major drivers for this kind of effect. First one is a reduction of costs of transportation and communication. So the idea really is here that costs can be reduced. That reduced the reduction of costs, especially in the form of transportation. So that means like we can easily and relatively cheaply ship products from one place to another. And also in communication, we can communicate via the internet and telephone, etc., relatively cheaply across the globe. And both of these aspects kind of remove barriers. So before it was before major globalization occurred, or did not occur, because transportation was a major obstacle. And while we had trade routes for centuries, some of them were very long and very cumbersome and didn't really integrate the markets completely, but rather kind of sequentialized it and kind of led for more widespread trade in this way, but not necessarily that to have a global market. And so this kind of reduction of policy barriers kind of increased the level of trade and investment across the globe. The question about now is really like, what do we see in terms of what do we see in terms of the baseline for judging how much global how far we are on the way of globalization? And so we can either judge by the standard from the 1990s or 1900, not 1990, sorry, 1900, and say like, okay, how far has the market integrated since then? Or we can judge it by what we are now, or here I wrote 2000, but we can basically say where we are now from the perspective of a perfectly integrated market, equivalent to a domestic market. And depending on what level we take as baseline, it's also our judgment might kind of vary considerably. But let me go to a first kind of interpretation and see how much integration could be there from 1900. So what we can see from this time on, we did have impressive breakthroughs in terms of transportation and communication. Transportation, shipment by sailing or transportation of goods around the globe by ship became much more efficient, much cheaper. GPS navigation, secure trade routes, less challenges by weather, piracy, and other things have led to kind of much smoother, more coordinated, and much cheaper forms of transportation. In terms of communication, of course, I mentioned already the internet, telephone, etc. were really important, fax machines, etc. were really important inventions, which led to a much smoother communication and make it almost real time by now. So whether you send a line message to your friend sitting in the next room, or to your friend sitting in Brazil, makes no difference in terms of time. So the message will be arriving in more or less in real time, immediately. Other things which are really important at the time of the 1900s is already that at that time already the transportation has been increased. Another really important factor was the political stability at the time. So if we kind of think back on one of our first classes about the historic events in the last century, we can see that at this stage we still had a situation of a so-called Pax Britannica. So the British Empire has been acting as a hegemon, and because it was unchallenged at the time, it led to a relative situation of stability. The so-called Pax Britannica, which was a peace, 100-year peace. Pax is the Latin word for peace, and so it's the 100-year peace, a British peace, under the ruling of, or the hegemony of the British Empire. And so this kind of stability helped a lot to develop trade at that time. There was also something like a monetary stability, and that was called the gold standard. What does the gold standard mean? We discussed this a little bit in our last class, but just to refresh it, gold standard basically means that a certain part of your currency is guaranteed by the amount of gold which is held by the central bank. And so we can see gold as an equivalent, we can see the currency used, so for example, the British pound, as an equivalent to a certain amount of gold. And how do we do this now? Do we still use the gold standard? No, we just short answer, no, we don't. By now, currencies are floating on the market, so the value of a currency depends on supply and demand. And so because they are not fixed in a way towards some precious metal like gold, they also can have big variations in their values. And so we do find inflation and deflation going on between different markets. So in this way, actually, the monetary stability at the time was maybe higher than it is nowadays. We did also, what you also experienced in 1900 was this kind of rapid growing trade. And according to, or not according, but following this kind of increase in trade, we also had like a massive narrowing of prices. So goods, which something which we still have in most parts of the world, local goods might be cheaper in a local market than they are abroad. So if you ever studied maybe in Europe or in the United States, and you wanted to buy Japanese goods, they might have been available, but you noticed that they were much more expensive than the way you were used to buy them in in Japan. So there is still a kind of a price difference in depending on what kind of market you buy, what kind of goods. But for important goods, especially in the beginning, in the 19th century, 1900s, what we did find was that these kind of price gaps dramatically narrowed. So what happened between the time from 1914 and 1944? So this was the period of the First and the Second World War, and in between the period of peace in between these two world wars. But what we found in this time is actually a giant move backwards. So around 1900, we had a quite high level of integrated markets and product becoming cheaper. So and maybe a first wave of globalization, if you want to. But in this period between around the First World War, in between period between the world wars and the Second World War, this movement, this kind of global trading movement towards global trade was kind of massively set back. So the reasons for this and what did we find? First of all, of course, the wars had kind of very big impact, but also something like an isolationist sentiments, especially in Western countries, in the United States, but also in European countries, where there was it was seen as necessary to develop its own economy rather independent of that of other nations, and kind of therefore focus on production and consuming goods from domestic goods. And this kind of led to a situation where actually the isolationists kind of put a strain on this kind of global markets and made them less important, but also less valuable to protect. Also, what we did have is situations of high inflation, like the monetary stability, which we experienced before, was not there anymore. And hyperinflation in countries like Germany, Italy, but also high inflation in the United States and the UK led to a situation where trade was becoming much less reliable, because the kind of exchange of the kind of security kind of provided by a fixed exchange rate of the currencies was basically gone. We also found that the countries, because they saw themselves much more competition, increased their tariffs and other forms of barriers, made it more difficult for products and services to enter markets from abroad. Especially if we kind of think about the fascist bloc of the 1930s and around Italy and Germany, and the rise of the communist bloc in Eastern Europe created systemic issues as well, which subsequently kind of reduced the trading between the different blocs quite extensively. In terms of after the time period between after 1940, what we can see is that, especially in the West, there was a promotion of economic integration alongside of political goals. So we have seen the development and the start, at least, of the European project, the European coal and steel community, which was the predecessor of the European community, which was the predecessor of the European Union, as we know it today, was kind of a big project to integrate European markets. Multilateral institutions like the ones I mentioned before, the United Nations on a political level, but also the World Trade Organizations and the IMF in economic terms have been established and became more and more important over time as well. But we do have to see, so from then on, we can see an integration, like a increased globalization, which got another boost in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. But what we have to see is that at the turn of the millennium, so in 2000, the world was not more integrated than in the 19th century. So in a way, there was a massive kind of a step back from 1900 to 1944, and why we have an increasing in the globalization again until 2000. It is basically at that time where it was around the same as 1900. Having said that, in the last 20 years, between 2000 and 2020, we have another extreme boost of globalization, especially of products and between the East and West, which is kind of far exceeding the situation of 1900. So if we kind of think about this this kind of massive change there, we can see that the current level we are trading on, so in 2020, is around the double of what we had in 1920, so 100 years ago. However, the ratio really falls short on something which we would kind of see as a perfectly integrated market in terms of like what you have on the national level. And some interesting aspect here is that this is not, that also the openness of the markets are far from perfect. So we still have trade barriers in terms of tariffs, in terms of other kind of trade barriers in terms of policies, and especially in terms of services, we have very often high levels of trade barriers still existing. So it is far, the kind of the market integration is far from what we would see as a domestic integration. But even organizations like the single market in the European Union, which is seen as one integrated market, still has a majority of its trading within the domestic level of the individual member countries. So areas within France, which are close to the German border, are trading much more with France than they are trading with their German counterpart. So we do see that these kind of national kind of trade connections are still important, even if we have an integrated market. Well, one of the problems is that we don't necessarily know how to measure well this kind of level of globalization. So in terms of statistical measures, we are using basically two different ones. One is the quantity of products, how much is international flow of goods, and in some sense also services, but especially focusing on goods. And what we can see is the increase. So I told you that it has doubled for in the last 100 years. So we can see the fractional increase of global trade. But we don't know what it would be the absolute, the optimal level, like a completely integrated market, how high the level would be, we don't know. And therefore we can't kind of really determine this. Another thing is to kind of look at the international differential in prices for specific products. And I mentioned before that products are kind of getting more similar in their prices. But what we also all know from going abroad, not all, some products are kind of priced equally in different parts of the world. So people came around and wanted to use some kind of products which are very universal in order to see how they are priced in different parts of the world. And so this was kind of often seen as the burger Big Mac index, which is basically kind of using a product which is available in most parts of the world, and this is like a fast food burger, and this kind of, and then comparing the prices these fast food burgers in different parts of the world gives us an indication how much fluctuation there is on these kind of products. If we kind of think about what are the key factors which contribute to barriers, well, we can find a couple of them. The first one is maybe the most obvious: geography. So the question is, how easily is it to access a certain country? Is it based on somewhere in the lands, or do you need land transportation, or has it big harbors and you can kind of be easily reached by shipping routes over the sea? The other thing is distance. So of course, a market which is closer in proximity might be more easy to reach, and therefore also cheaper to reach. And so distance is an important factor as well. But we also find, what we find in these kind of studies is that it's not only the physical kind of distance between it, but also the psychological distance. And some of the aspects here are the language, so can the countries understand each other? The cultural kind of component, how is the culture, how sympathetic they are to each other, but also, and that is really going into it, so historical trade routes are really kind of, how historical connections are really important. So we can see, like, previous conflict can be a serious obstacle. In a way, we can see this in the relationship between Japan and South Korea. While both markets are very close to each other, and they're also very similar in terms of in terms of cultural understanding, etc. But we do see historical issues, especially leading back to the Second World War, and based on the Japanese occupation, which kind of creates sentiments in both countries and make it difficult to have a very efficient kind of trading connection here. We also know that landlocked countries engage in less trade. That is what I said before, also about the geography. Also, if they're big kind of big mountain ranges, etc., which are hard to overcome, they have an impact as well. Colonial factors are also really interesting. One in terms of linguistic, but also in terms of sympathy or kind of tensions between the countries. So we do find some colonies trading very well with the former colonial powers. We see several kind of African countries in Franco Africa having good relations, trading relations with France. We see Britain has good trading relations with India. Also, but there we see. But we also see situations where countries were really opposed to their former colonial powers, and therefore kind of trading is massively hindered. So it can go in both directions. But last thing which I want to mention here is also that military factors are also important. So military allies are often very kind of much better connected and better trading. So, for example, the trade relationship between Japan and the United States is very good. It also the political and military cooperation is very good. One thing which is quite difficult to see here is what is the chicken and what is the egg. Does good trading relations lead to more sympathetic or cooperation in other areas, like in terms of defense, or is it the defense aspect which kind of increases the possibility for trade? If we kind of, one thing which is really important in contributing to this, to increase the trade between different countries or different regions, are free trade areas. And so we kind of see that there are many kind of international trade barriers are kind of lifted in terms of specific trade agreements. These kind of trade agreements kind of have the power to kind of steer trade in in different directions, and are often very competitive. So trade agreements, for example, within the EU are very good for the countries which are members of the European Union, because it increases their trade capacity. But at the same time, it's not necessarily very good in terms of for external countries who also want to trade with partners in the European Union, because they have a much stiffer competition in this. We do see free trade agreements, especially in terms of like France and its overseas department, have very close political link, which also lead to very close trading links. We have also other kind of things like the OECD. Trade agreements are very popular at the moment. We also have a new trade agreement between Japan and the European Union, between Canada and the European Union, between Mercosur and the European Union is on ice at the moment, but kind of things. ASEAN has very recently kind of signed a trade agreement, so among each other, but including countries like South Korea, China, and Japan as well. So we do feel that more and more trade agreements are also becoming popular. One really important aspect here is also the integration of financial markets. Why would this be the case? Well, because foreign direct investment and also capital flow is really imminent for economic development. And what we do see in the last 30 years, that it has increased tremendously. But in a way, it is still, and that can have huge advantages in terms of financing, but it can also be quite problematic, how we have seen in the global financial crisis, where problems in the mortgage problems in the very big market of the United States kind of created problems afterwards in the European Union and many other countries in the world. So we do see that this kind of gross volume of cross-border capital flow has grown very, very large, and it can have very big impacts on the economic development of individual countries. Having said that, is that it's much less than complete, and also what we do see is that the markets are not necessarily integrated, that the policies are not integrated, and that we do have domestic or local regulation for transaction on financial capital flow, which still is a big hindrance and have a very high transaction costs as well as imperfect information on the financial markets. Yeah. A question, of course, which probably you have been asking you since the beginning of this class, is that how we kind of position this kind of form of globalization, not just how it happens and where it happened, but also, is it something which is kind of aspirational, which is a good thing, normatively speaking, or is it problematic? And what we do find, of course, is that it kind of goes in both directions. What we do find is that countries which are more open are having higher growth rates. But what we don't know, and what we should maybe discuss as in our class, is whether openness leads to growth, or whether it's growth which leads to increased openness. We do find that openness, that the effect on openness on growth is stronger than vice versa. But we do have, of course, a very big macroeconomic interdependence, and we generally increase the transmission of business cycle fluctuations across countries. What we do see is, in terms of financial markets, we do see that overall this kind of increase the efficiency. But it can also be seen as or globalization on trade as well as on finances can be seen very problematic, how we will just discuss in the next slides. So we do see that investment and international trade can be a powerful source for growth in poor countries. So if they didn't have the possibility for economic development before, this can be a real opportunity to increase. But it also is a real problematic in terms of creating inequality in incomes, inequality in lucrative industries, and this kind of one of the major criticisms about globalization is that it kind of increases the income gap between the rich and the poor. And what we can see, this income gap between the rich and the poor, we can see at the one hand, the income gap between rich countries and poor countries, but also the rich and the poor within a country. So what we do find is that rich parts of the society have more opportunity to utilize the global networks, and therefore are kind of over-proportionally benefiting from it. While poorer parts in the economics don't have the same opportunities, and therefore have a more problematic situation. So just to see this from the perspective of a wealthy country like Japan, the United States, or some European country, what you could see here is that companies which are kind of leaders in development on a global level, they profit over proportionally from globalizations. Why? They can sell their products on a global scale, but also they can kind of move production to places where income is lower and therefore production is cheaper. So, for example, to Southeast Asia, India, Africa, etc. So we do see that lots of companies kind of shift their production to countries with cheaper labor costs. So overall, they will benefit in two ways: bigger markets and smaller costs for production. But that leads within the rich countries also to problems, because if production is moved to lower income countries, we also overall have less jobs, and especially manual labor, blue-collar labor jobs available in the individual countries, in the rich countries, which can kind of increase the level of poverty of certain parts of the population. If we kind of think about it in terms of between different countries, we also see that even if the production and the development of products is shared between developed and developing countries, what we also find is that the majority of the gain from these kind of products is not going to the developing countries, but rather to the developed countries. So the gap between developing countries and developed countries is also increasing. We will kind of look at this North-South debate much more in the next class, but we do see that one of the big criticisms about globalization is that the income gap between countries and the income gap within countries is becoming bigger through globalization. Another real big criticism is in the level of the environment. So we do find that globalization has a big impact on the environment. Why? Because it increases, on the one hand, it increases transportation dramatically, and that is kind of a big issue of pollution. But also it kind of reduces environmental. It reduces the policy opportunities for countries to regulate its environmental impact. So what we do find is that if rules are specifically strict in certain regions or countries, that production is moved to countries where this is more relaxed. So this reduces the cost for producing these things, but at the same time, of course, is is kind of bad for the environment. And so we are shifting the problem to other countries, and this kind of avoidance leads to increased pollution. additionally to the increased pollution due to the transportation. In terms of political implications, we have also, of course, several things to note. We do see a drain of political authority from the nation state. Why? Because these international trade routes become more important, and therefore governments often needs to be kind of done on a global level rather than on a domestic level. And also we do see that there are newly empowered actors like multinational corporations, which become more, which yield political power as well. So they, for example, can kind of say whether they want to enter or not enter a specific market, but they have also influence on these kind of markets. So we can see that like big companies like saying like the big IT companies, Google, Facebook, etc., are kind of very easy to switch between different kind of between different countries, and therefore have the opportunity at the one hand to optimize their revenues by maybe reducing their tax burden, but also kind of have influence on these specific markets in terms of policies and regulations. But what we do see still is that the states still seem to be the most important actors. And in the specific kind of spheres of governance, like defense, criminal justice, migration, we find that the state is still the one entity which is the most important one. If we kind of look at how far we are along the lines in terms of globalization, we see that there is very big kind of form of globalization, especially between Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe and the United States. But large parts of Latin America, Russia, the Middle East, and also Africa are kind of left out of this equation, and they're not integrated in the global market as yet, as we might see it here in Japan or other East Asian countries and European and in the United States. So, but we also see that the money market has been actually becoming much more global. So for of course, finance and monetary transfer is becoming increasingly simple, and therefore we have finances can be moved very, very quickly. This kind of creates issues in terms of taxation, but also in terms of crisis situation. It becomes very difficult for countries, for nation states to kind of have single solutions to problems which often very kind of overspend many, like global financial markets, for example. But we do see, as I mentioned before, the north-south divide is still wide, maybe even wider than it used to be. We do find some kind of political economic institutions like the European Union are kind of creating more increased integrated markets, but even their popularity is fluctuating, and now we see it now in Europe with the Brexit can also lead to not only in one direction of more integration, but also can lead in the opposite direction of actually less integration. So the last question I would like to hear is this question between interdependence and integration of world markets. So in a way, an integrated world would look like maybe one big market and one big state. So in a way, if you have one market and then you do need to have some kind of political integration as well, because you need to have same policies, same kind of issue, not only on issues of trade, but also on issues of labor laws, issues of education, issues of environmental policies, etc. So this kind of, what we have to see is that an integrated market cannot function without a kind of common political understanding. And that is something which we actually don't find at the moment in the on a global level. We actually see that frictions between different countries, different regions are becoming wider, and rather than kind of becoming smaller. And we do see that the world has kind of is more and more interdepending on trade with each other, but they don't really find this kind of idea of common economic integration. Maybe one symptom for this is that in the recent years, organizations like the G20 became much less important, because people felt that interdependence might be sufficient and integration of markets is not necessary, because it is too difficult to overcome these big political cleavages. So what we do find in interdependent market is that national policies are kind of defining the goals of the development, and that we don't find that there is like a block building as we have with integrated markets. But in a way, that kind of creates that states are differentiating from one another by the not necessarily by their function, but by their capabilities. And so this again reinforces this inequality in the capabilities, and then also the inequality in the revenues. So an uneven distribution of capability continues to be the key of our understanding of international politics. And the question which we could ask ourselves is whether this leads to less conflict or rather to more conflict. Something which we see with the current trade war between the United States and China is that maybe it leads actually to more conflict rather than less. So that's it from me for this week. I hope you enjoyed this lecture on globalization, and I look forward seeing all of you in class. If you have any questions, then we will kind of continue to discuss there. Until then, I hope you have a great time. Take care and bye-bye.